So I was very lucky. I was very lucky because, as you all know, I had scheduled Thursday for my normal fun live with you all to discuss naval history. And in fact, the topic was going to be a pretty cool one. What happens if Jackie Fisher dies and Louis Brandenburg continues on as the first Sea Lord? Honestly, he's not the world's most innovative thinker, but he's also not a bad one to have in charge. Certainly, without the politics going around him, he would have been capable of managing things and doing quite well. And he's certainly more of the Jellicoe school and supporting Jellicoe and Beatty. And in terms of dealing with Churchill, well, Churchill would find himself probably still trying to force out Brandenburg at some point because he wouldn't reflect Churchill's style at all. He's far too professional, but it would be something which Churchill couldn't easily do because of his royal connections. Fisher could do it, because Fisher was the Navy by that time, pushing back and pushing him out. But Churchill, going against the royal family and people with royal connections that openly, ooh, that could have been bad for him and his future career. And also, he was a natural deference towards members of the royal family, even extended members of the royal family. It's quite cute in some ways. But that will have to wait till tomorrow night when you see this. Instead, tonight, I am at a birthday dinner. One I couldn't get out of. Not for me, thankfully. I managed to avoid that. But what was really funny was I'm always in charge of pretty much organising the parties. And I had everything sort of worked out for the Friday, because for this particular person, my sister, she always usually specifies her birthday party and her events be on the Friday or the Saturday. It doesn't matter which day of the week her birthday falls on. However, this year she's got stuff organised on the Friday and the Saturday. So she wanted on the Thursday. Trouble is, she only told me literally Saturday afternoon. I have managed to rearrange everything, and I have managed to rearrange it all. It wasn't, frankly, that much of a difficult task. But it is done. And I will be once again celebrating my older sister's 21st birthday. This will be the... I'm not going to reveal quite how many times I have celebrated this particular birthday for her, with her, but all the women in my family only ever reached 21. I have somehow therefore managed to not only be born after my sister, but have overtaken her in age. I am, of course, now deep into my 30s, and far too close to that big 40, and I still haven't been to Japan, and I still haven't gone round the aircraft carriers in the US yet as a tourist, and actually gone and been able to go look around them and spend the time looking around them. Funny thing to have a list of things you want to do before you're 40. I have 2 which are abroad and 2 which are in the UK to tick off. I do believe in having these lists. One of them is visit Dover Castle and actually get to spend about 3 days going around there, because I have visited Dover Castle and I swear you can't actually do it in a day visit. You need to actually stay nearby and go back day after day after day to cover it properly, because there is just so much there and so much in the defence environs. And the other thing I want to do in the UK, that's a discussion for another time. But I was lucky, because the key aircraft, which was scheduled for Friday, which I'm using now as this premiere, so thank you and welcome to this Thursday premiere, so you still get a live, and so you still get a discussion, and there's going to be the live tomorrow evening. Don't worry, we're going to be discussing that stuff about Fisher and Louis Brandenburg and all the other stuff. Well, it's the Hansa-Brandenburg. It is. And I just realised I might have been calling Battenberg Brandenburg during this whole thing. This is the trouble with having Battenberg and Brandenburg in the same discussion. They are going to confuse my brain. But I am going to keep to Brandenburg for the Hansa-Brandenburgs, and hopefully I did say Battenberg at least once correctly. Oh, the joy. The joy of life. My thumb's still recovering. I do not recommend dropping doorsteps on it. Anyway, Hansa-Brandenburg is an interesting aircraft factory and manufacturer. I would say it's where Ernst Heinkel really comes of age. I know he claims he did all sorts of interesting things in his early years, including when he worked for Albatros, or Albatros Flugzeugwerk Gummel. But no. No, he didn't get up to nearly as much as he claims he did while he was there. And honestly, he is far more happy at Hansa-Brandenburg, and he is even more happy once he gets control of his own company. And he is one of the characters we're going to be talking about today. But honestly, this company does not get enough affection in history, but it's kind of difficult to do separate videos about their aircraft. I was looking at it for the Key Aircraft series. I was considering doing an entire series where I would literally every episode would have been a different one of their aircraft. But I found myself every time I tried to record that, and I did write it for about 3 of them, jumping backwards and forwards talking about the previous ones. And I was going, well, this is going to be a video, therefore, where I will spend most of my time skipping back and going, well, for this idea, you have to look at this earlier type, and then you have to go look at that video or that video, and I just thought I'll do it all in one. So, welcome to the Hansa-Brandenburg series. Now, of course, no video of mine would be complete without a shameless book plug. Thank you, everyone who's bought copies. Please, please, if you're interested in the subject, please do keep buying them. This is quite literally pretty much the only thing an academic can do that they can have control of to try and promote their career is book sales. Journal articles, well, I have given up trying to get journal articles. Or rather, let me put it this way. I have 6 articles which have been for about the last 5 years in the process of going through. I have not written a new article since the 6th one. I am waiting until they're published. Or at least half of them are published, and then I will write another article. Because I just don't see it as a good use of my time. I'm writing more books, I'm happy to write those. Finding the money for the pictures is the interesting thing, but we're sorting that out, and that is something I'm working on, and something which, frankly, some people have been very generous about. But honestly, the journal articles, which are supposed to be how an academic produces their career and shows off their shining latest example of research, you can get a book published in like a third of the time. And I'm talking a full 75 to 100,000 word book will be published in about a third of the time, if you have the money and the pictures ready to go. And yes, you can say, well, it doesn't go through the peer review process. Well, in my experience, it's not the peer review process that holds it up. It's the admin process, because all the journals are so oversubscribed, and then they're so expensive they barely get any readers. And this is no critique of any of the people involved in the process, because I've worked with several of them. They're lovely people. It's just fun. Anyway, the Hansa-Brandenburg class. Well, I say class. Series. This is the trouble with talking about ships often. You think in terms of phraseology of class, and well, this is a series, but it's also it's also a manufacturer. And well, their basic philosophy is they want to make money. This actually makes them very good builders of aircraft, because their philosophy is if they build a good quality aircraft that delivers what's been asked for it, maybe with a little bit better, they will get asked for more. Camillo Castiglione is probably one of the better entrepreneurs that Germany is lucky to use in World War I. He's an Italian-Austrian Jewish financier. So he would be absolutely hated by Nazi Germany. And banker, of course, as well, and was probably wealthiest, or at least one of the wealthiest people in Central Europe during World War One. He was especially keen in aviation and investing in the arts. And he was, as well as founding Hansa-Brandenburg, he was also instrumental in founding what would become BMW to this day. He is a very interesting, very capable gentleman who did at one point go bankrupt, trying arguably to get revenge for World War One by shorting the franc. As it was, he, how do I put this, managed to be undone by schemes of the Banque de France, and who were ably supported by J.P. Morgan. And, his plan to make a killing on shorting the franc crashed around him, and the bank he was in charge of, president of, collapsed. But don't worry, the warrant that was issued for his charge of fraud and arrest was taken care of, thanks to him still being in Italy, as on the request that he deposited $4,200,000, which was the value then. Today, that's probably closer to $80 million. He was instrumental in setting up nearly 200 companies, honestly. I wanted to say 100, over 100, but it's far closer to 200. Not quite 200. And he works on so many things. He really does finance the industrialization of Central Europe and Austria, Germany, and Italy. And as said, his companies all come up with a similar thing. He wants to make money. Therefore, he wants to deliver a quality product that people want to buy, and preferably buy at a premium because they recognize it is a quality product and therefore it's going to work. Most importantly, he invests in people. He is very happy to work with egomaniacs and people who are very sure of how brilliant they are, as long as they actually are brilliant. If they aren't, they get short shrift. In the case of Hansa-Brandenburg, he purchased the Brandenburgische Flugwerk and relocated it to Brandenburg an der Havel. He then decided to open up more factories, including one in Rummelsburg, Berlin, and one in Wandsbek, Hamburg. And by the autumn of 1915, they were not only the largest aircraft manufacturer in Germany, and I'm gonna guess quite a lot of people haven't heard of them, because usually people talk about the Fokkers. It's kind of like everyone was shot down by a Spitfire or occasionally an Me-109, depending on which side you're on. In World War One, if you're shot down by an enemy aircraft, I'm sure it was a Fokker or an Albatross. Well, actually, a fair number of you were shot down by Hansa-Brandenburg aircraft. You just don't like to talk about them because they're not the sexy-looking aircraft. They're the capable aircraft that do a lot of the reconnaissance, a lot of the strikes, and just provide all the aircraft doing all the other duties that need to be done. Cassini, of course, was primarily an Austrian. He was an Italian-Austrian. And he produced a lot of aircraft not only for Germany, which was the primary manufacturing base, and, pretty much all the manufacturing was in Germany. Some parts were elsewhere, but primary manufacturing was Germany. But he built primarily for the Imperial German Navy and the Austro-Hungarian Aviation Corps. That's who he was supplying most often. After World War One, a number of his designs, or the firm's designs, continued to be procured in countries such as Finland, Norway, and a few others, because they were such good quality, reliable designs. And he had those designs and all these wonderful aircraft. And I haven't picked out all their aircraft. These are the aircraft which we are discussing today. They are, by and large, the reconnaissance floatplane aircraft, the aircraft produced primarily for the Navy. They were some of the most interesting aircraft, to my mind, that were actually produced. There is, of course, the Hansa-Brandenburg KDW, which isn't up there, and there's a reason it's not up there. It was a sort of fighter variant, and 58 of them were built. But the fact is, it's something which I want to talk about in its own video at some point in the future. It's one of the few which is a sort of a standalone development, and it gets into enough random stuff and enough random events that really it deserves its own video. So we're starting off with the Hansa-Brandenburg W series, and that's cool. Now, their chief designer was Ernst Haeckel, and he is complicated. He's honestly very happy to work for Jews. He's very happy to work with Jews. He's one of the people who actually objects to a lot of the issues which come up with Adolf Hitler's anti-Jewish rules, regulations, and actions. Principally because he was forced to fire his Jewish designers and staff in 1933 by Adolf Hitler. And the thing was, he didn't like to suffer fools gladly. He had quite good staff. He felt he was losing good quality people because of stupidness. However, saying that, he was also a member of the Nazi Party. He joined the Nazi Party, and he was passionate about Germany and German rearmament and German power and status in the world. He is saying that he's also, he's made a very senior member of the defense industry by being designated a Wehrwirtschaftsführer, a defense industry leader. However, of course, in 1942, he's also forced to sell a controlling interest in his factories to Hermann Goering, and he's forced by being detained until he agrees to it. He'd set up a company by that point. He was proud of his company. He was delivering on aircraft, and in 1942, he's forced to sell a controlling interest to Hermann Goering. His main philosophies for aircraft are speed and rugged reliability. This causes him to do some very interesting designs. And honestly, if you look through a lot of the aircraft which came out of Heinkel, especially pre-1942, they are often some of the aircraft which are the more reliable options for Germany to select. Saying that, his interest in speed did lead to him working a lot with Werner von Braun, and led to him sponsoring research of Hans von Oppen about turbojet engines, and working on various designs which included some versions of the America bomber design. He's an overall complicated character, and I should also add as well, he was so happy to have Jewish people working for him. He was not disappointed to use the forced labor camps. He was quite happy with that. I'm not sure what you can really sum him up as. Complicated. A human being. Not necessarily guilty of the worst excesses of his time, but not an innocent dove either, by any stretch of the imagination. But this is World War One. This is when he is just beginning. And when he's coupled with Castellani, who is prepared to fund him as long as he produces quality. So that's what Heinkel sets out to do. Produce quality. Now here's the interesting thing. The W11, that's really the beginning of the stream that's going to produce some really great aircraft towards the end of the war. It's a prototype though. And it's all produced thanks to, well, the BI and the W. And the W I've already had a picture of earlier. It was here. But the B1, BI, B1 I think it's the B1, was really the starting point, along with the W, of Hansa-Brandenburg as an organisation. These are the ones they get ordered to build in 1914. This, the W gets 77 orders. It's not really a prototype because, well, frankly, so many of it is ordered. And the B1, how do I put this politely? It serves with the Austro-Hungarian Imperial and Royal Aviation Troops. It also serves with the Austro-Hungarian Navy. It sort of serves with so many different organisations, and it is the starting point for them. Its primary user are the Austrians, and I've talked about it before. But the fact is, these designs both represent a starting point and a philosophy beginning. They're not necessarily the best designs, but they establish Hansa-Brandenburg as a reliable company aiming to deliver reliable aircraft. The aircraft themselves might have interesting habits, let's be honest. The W, not the fastest aircraft in the world, and very quickly goes from its Benz Mark II engine to the Mercedes D3 engine. They literally, out of the 77 built, the first 27 get the Benz, and the remaining 50 get Mercedes D3s. And that doesn't matter whether they're NW or GNW types. And this is really their starting of their profile. Now, I have to admit, they go off into some interesting land planes, which I will discuss at a certain point, especially with the idea of talking about a potential aircraft selection for a German World War I carrier if they'd gone for it. Because I have a sneaking suspicion, and I'm including this because this is a premiere, of course, so this is sort of like a live. I have a sneaking suspicion that the whole idea I discussed a week or so ago about Furious, Courageous and Glorious, if they'd been built as aircraft carriers rather than battle cruisers, might turn up as a video again. Judging from patron reactions, I'm guessing I'll probably get a patron suggestion about it if I haven't already. I've been too busy reading the wonderful submissions and trying to set aside enough to go to the marking panel, sort of the judging panel, for the writing competition. So I've not really kept up with Patreon this week. There's only so many hours in the day. Dealing with lawyers takes up far too much of it. So the reality is, I'm fairly certain that's going to come up as a Patreon question, and if it doesn't come up as a Patreon question, honestly, it's started me thinking enough that I've been thinking about it. And the question becomes, does Germany pursue it as an option themselves? Do they push for a similar aircraft, a similar vessel? And if they do, what do they select? And my honest view is that the Kaiserliche Marine would go with Hansa-Brandenburg as their company. They were far more the Navy company than any other organisation. They were considered far more reliable. They fitted the Navy's needs. A lot of the problem of the German aircraft in World War I suffered from a similar problem that they had in World War II. And there's a reason why this company doesn't get the attention it necessarily deserves, because it produces reliable, stalwart, capable aircraft. Honestly, if you're using those phrases in World War II, you're probably talking about something like the Fairy Swordfish. Maybe you're going to talk about the Grumman Avenger. But again, reliable, stalwart, sort of sits that one. They don't necessarily have the dash of some of the other companies' productions, Fokker, Albatros, but they do have quality, and they do produce some very good torpedo bombers. And that's an interesting thing to think about when you're talking about a carrier construction this time period, because again, one of the really interesting things that is often overlooked is that dive bombing didn't sink a ship realistically till World War II. Wouldn't sink an aircraft, and remember, aircraft can be singular or plural. It doesn't matter if it's a one aircraft or a dozen aircraft. No S. It's like watercraft. And yes, that is the joy of English. But leaving that to one side, dive bombing gets some interesting close calls in the Spanish Civil War. And there are the Yangtze River incidents, but those are Yangtze River boats, which are their own intriguing set of circumstances and don't really count from that perspective. And of course, yes, there were some interesting exercises, but those didn't really test dive bombing. What you had, though, even in World War One, was an appreciation that torpedo aircraft could sink ships. Because torpedoes can sink ships, and if an aircraft can drop torpedoes, it can. Hansa-Brandenburg work with torpedo bombers. Some gorgeous ones, some great ones. So, they have, as said, the W, this one, gets 77 orders, and it's really, really important for the German Navy. The Kaiserliche Marine goes, this is working. And so then they start sort of going, well, hang on, we need something else for a slightly different mission. And that starts off with the W11. There are other designs in between, but they don't seem to be built. And this was a float plane. Now, it was based on the KDW, which was itself a very interesting fighter float plane. A very interesting sort of aircraft entirely. But that aircraft was also a development from the D1 land plane, which was a development from the B1 land plane. And what can I say really about the KDW? It's cute. It's procured in September 1916. It will serve till 1918. And the KDW, or the Kampf Doppeldecker Wasser, or Fighter Biplane Water, as that stands for, was there to provide coastal defence over the North Sea. The thing is, though, the 58 aircraft were actually not built by Hansa-Brandenburg. Oh, that one. They were built by Phoenix under license in 5 batches. So whilst they're a Hansa-Brandenburg design, the KDW is not really them designing and building it. They've already moved on. And the W is literally one of the really cool things is the Hansa-Brandenburg, the KDW is entering service in 1916. At the same point, they're already ordering its successor, which starts out as the W11, of which there are 3 prototypes made. They test them out. It has a similar configuration. It's shared the same interplane strut arrangement, which you can see there, which is really quite cool. It looks to some extent like a beach defense system, has been put between the wings, but it was supposed to give it a lot of strength and a lot of ability to pull a lot of hard maneuvers and therefore not damage the wing when doing so. And it had a top speed of 96 knots and a range of 189 nautical miles. All thanks to a Mercedes-Benz 4A 220 horsepower engine. This is one of the interesting things. Hansa-Brandenburg likes to work with the various engine companies, but they do start to get a certain, how do I put this politely, habit. But what this aircraft really was a dramatic pushing forward of technology and a dramatic growth in capability. It was really something which, how do I put this politely, the German Navy was pushing forward with. Now, what I have to say is really interesting is the fact that Hansa-Brandenburg were shamelessly focusing in on the Kaiserliche Marine and the Kaiserlich und Königlich Kriegsmarine, i.e. the Austro-Hungarian Navy, which was called the Imperial and Royal War Navy, hence the Kaiserlich und Königlich Kriegsmarine, or I'm not going to even try and pronounce the Hungarian. My German's bad enough as it is, without me trying to butcher the Hungarian as well. Both these navies really do get a lot of attention from this company, and again, it seems to be something quite smart from this company. They seem to approach the idea of, we can deal best with a technical user who can tell us what they want, because then we can deliver it, and we can make them happy. And it was one of the interesting things from a lot of various suppliers when you read between the lines of their discussions and their dealings with the army, especially for both of the Central Powers. They found them not to be that technically minded when it came to procurement of equipment. Or rather, the personnel they were dealing with were not the technically minded ones, which was quite disappointing to them. It was quite disappointing to a lot of companies, because it meant they weren't quite sure what they were supposed to do. Now, the 11 gets turned into the 12 when it's actually being put into, actually being created, because they decide they want something better. They want something better. The Dutch end up building 35 of these. The Germans merely have 146. Again, Mercedes D3 turns up again. It's amazing how that engine keeps getting returned to. It's got 160 horsepower. It's an absolute brute of an engine for its time period, and a very simplistic brute, but it's reliable. It's really reliable. And to illustrate that, I can actually point to something now. So if I do, I think about that, and click that, not quite right. So, the Hansa-Brandenburg W12 is a really gorgeous aircraft. It's also quite a scientific aircraft, but it's also a very simple aircraft in its own ways. It's designed very much to be this reconnaissance aircraft, this fighter reconnaissance aircraft, and that's what it was for. It's described by some as a float plane fighter, but it's got a two-seater cockpit. It has the ability to carry interesting things attached to it. They did work on some bombs. It has an endurance of 3 hours and 30 minutes, a range of 280 nautical miles, a service ceiling of 16,000 feet, and a top speed of 86 knots. So it's not their fastest, but it's not exactly bad. And it's a very solid, reliable aircraft for them. It truly is. It's something which allows them to expand their understanding of what's going on in their immediate vicinity quite well. And you have to remember, the reason the Kaiserliche Marine is focusing in on float plane aircraft is, you see here you've got this being hoisted aboard a ship. Well, for the Kaiserliche Marine, it was very sensible to have a scenario where they could rapidly move their infrastructure around, i.e. have it ship-based, and then have the aircraft operate out from their area. So it's kind of like the spider's web scenario the Royal Navy would be adopting to try and use float planes and seaplanes to hunt for submarines in World War One as an anti-submarine warfare operation. But whereas the Royal Naval Air Service build, I want to call them aquadrones, because they're not really air bases, because they're mostly focused on launching seaplanes. So aquadromes is what I'm going to go with. The Royal Navy focuses on that quite heavily. In contrast, the Germans, the Kaiserliche Marine, they do that occasionally, but really, again, what they really like is to have the mobile infrastructure to support the movement of forces and the fact that things change rapidly. Even in World War One, the pace of conflict is moving up, it's changing, it's faster, it's more organized, but also more frantic. In 1918, one of these made an emergency landing in the Netherlands. And it was in turn and tested by the Dutch, and they really liked it. And as said, what they did was in 1919, they bought a license to build it. And they built 35 of them. And they served with the Dutch Naval Air Service till 1933. This is how solid this aircraft was. It was still serving in 1933, and the Dutch were not complaining about it. It was perfectly capable for the functions it needed to do. Reconnaissance, a bit of float plane fighter work, and a bit of other general purpose duties. It was perfectly good at this. Now, I'm going to need to hide that and grow this again, because the next aircraft that they built was the Hansa-Brandenburg W13. A not too unconventional design. It has a single step hull, and the engine is mounted pusher fashion, as you can see, thanks to struts supporting it in the interplane gap between the wings. The pilot and gunner sat in tandem open cockpits at the bow. The struts, as you can see, are an evolution of the earlier design. You can really see where Hansa-Brandenburg are developing their strut architecture from. It's not quite the same, but that's because this is a slightly different aircraft and the effects on its operation are different. This was actually offered to the Kaiserliche Marine, but it was rejected. However, our good friends in the Kaiserliche und Königliche Kriegsmarine looked at this and went, we like it. We like it a lot. I especially liked that the struts, which form a V shape if you look at them in various points, provide for a lot of structural strength and a lot of structural capabilities in terms of doing hard landings and rigorous operations. As such, they decided to procure it and built them on a license by UFAG in Budapest. The Austro-Daimler engine, though, proved continuously an issue. It actually almost ruined the company in terms of its lack of reliability, which meant Hansa-Brandenburg actually worked on it. And they found that its problem was poor lubricating oil being available at the front. So whilst at home, when they were doing testing, they had the highest quality oil in testing, and they of course couldn't get the highest quality oil in the field. This actually led to Austro-Daimler discontinuing production of the engine, which meant that a lot of the W13s ended up getting different engines. And a lot of them were also captured by the Italian forces and studied. They even handed over to the United States Navy as part of war operations, which was shipped to the Naval Aircraft Factory, where it was dismantled, and reassembled, and dismantled, and reassembled, and test flown. What can I say? The US found it interesting. What's really sad is the Austro-Daimler engine was a 360 horsepower engine, which could give them a really solid speed for their almost 3 tons of weight. And their armament was multiple bombs, plus a trainable machine gun in the own position in the bow, which of course had the gun operating it. It was a really potentially very good aircraft. Let down by the fact that, in true German historical style, everything needed to be perfect to get the best out of it. And then you could get something really good out of it when it was perfect. When it wasn't, it just wasn't. The W-19. 55 of these built, and again, fighter reconnaissance aircraft. This was basically, they took the W-12, which they've been really enjoying, really utilizing well, and decided there was a requirement to have a greater endurance for... Theoretically, this was for the fighter role, but let's be honest, it was for the reconnaissance role. And Heinkel basically decided, I know what you're asking me about, I'm gonna do this. I suddenly just went, are they paying? Yes, then deliver it. So the W-19 was basically a W-12, but on steroids. It was a 2.6 meter greater wingspan and a 1 meter greater length. It was a single engine tractor arrangement applied by plane with 2 bay wings, i.e. tractor instead of pusher, so the engine's at the front rather than behind. It was fitted with the same inverted tailplane as you'd have seen on W-12. If we go back to the W-12, you can see that inverted tailplane. Now, I didn't make a big fuss of it then because I wanted to talk about it now. But the inverted tailplane was considered a very useful thing because it gave unobstructed fields of fire to the observer, allowing them to fire without damaging the tailplane. It was, of course, seated in the rear cockpit. And it also potentially meant if they landed correctly and it dipped in the water, they had a theoretical rudder. Although it wasn't good to use it as that, and they preferred not to with their style of landing. Now, to compensate for what was a much increased size and weight over the W-12, they got the Maybach MB4 engine. Now, this is a cool engine. It really is. It has 250 horsepower. If we consider the B12, the W12, its engine was 160 horsepower. An extra 90 horsepower is a more than 50% increase in the horsepower. And you've gone up from under 1.5 tons to a little over 2 tons and maximum weight. That's great. You've gone up a third in weight, over 50% in power. That's improving your power to weight ratio, which is important for a float plane especially. They had a top speed of 82 knots, they had endurance of 5 hours. They could get to 3,300 feet, that's 1,000 meters, in 6 minutes and 24 seconds. 6 minutes and 24 seconds. The G-force would be terrible. They had 2 fixed forward-firing machine guns and a flexible Parallon MG14 in the rear cockpit. They were all 7.92mm guns. It was really quite a useful aircraft, and one of them was even fitted with a 20mm Becker cannon for tests. And again, this is something they were considering. They were considering upgrading the cannon even in World War I because of the hit value of it. They operated mostly from Borkum and Zeebrugge, primarily doing North Sea operations, and primarily it was used to support the smaller W-12 and occasionally W-29 aircraft when they came into service. Often it was used as a forward scout. So the smaller aircraft would literally be waiting on the sea. The W-19 would go find to target, and then it would call them in for closer reconnaissance and closer viewing. They often ended up in fights with things like Felixstowe F2s and Curtiss Americas, which were... I'd like to say they were even matches, but if you have looked at the F2s and you have looked at the Curtiss Americas, you'll notice there is a very big difference going on in their size and structuring. These are far more fighters, those are far more long-range reconnaissance flying boats. And that wasn't necessarily a good scenario. If these managed to get the jump on them, they certainly had the edge. Eventually it was decided that they were going to supplement this with the W-33 monoplane, and actually they were planning on supplementing the W-12s with the W-29s, but those two both came quite late to the party in terms of wartime service. This had its first flight in 1918. So as you can see, we've got to 19, and it's 1918. The war doesn't go on for much longer. This was reflective of the fact that the German government, especially the Kaiserlich Marine, were not really in any way on an institutional level acknowledging that they were not doing well in the war, that the blockade was having an impact, that they weren't making the ground, they weren't achieving what they needed to do on the ground warfare. Things just weren't going that well. So they were spending a lot of money on developing things. And this is where we get to our next set of aircraft, because I've given you some numbers, but there were more prototypes. There was a W-20 submarine-launched reconnaissance flying boat. And this is a cute little thing, it really is. But it's not just this. They then skip to W-21 to 26 because those things don't get built. There's a dispute over the 23. It might have been a prototype, it might not have actually been prototyped, but this was to be launched from a submarine. The idea was it could be assembled and dismantled quickly on a submarine once it had surfaced, and would therefore allow them the ability to spot what was going on, to find the ships they wanted to attack. Interesting enough, it's powered by a 7-cylinder, 80 horsepower, roughly, Oberrussel rotary engine, which was pretty much a German-made clone of the Gnome Lambada, which had been a pre-war French rotary engine. It had a crew of 1, it had an endurance of 1 hour and 15 minutes, it had a top speed of 63 knots, and they actually built 3 of them. Come on, it's cute. You know you want one. We all want one. It is quite literally 6 meters in length, roughly, it's 7 centimeters off it, and 6.8 meters in wingspan. You could fit that in most gardens. We all want one of these in our own garden. We want a pond large enough we can have it just bobbing there on it. It'd just be cool. And it weighs less than 600 kilograms. All in, weighs less than 600 kilograms. And that might be a bit much for most of us to lift solo, but you and a couple of friends could move one of these around easily as anything. So, for that, as the price of pizza, you could get one assembled and have it in your house, in your pond. And come on, we all want that. We all want one of these. The thing is, they don't really have a submarine that's suitable for it at this point. They are working on some larger submarines, especially the mine-laying submarines, and that could have been really intriguing, because for mine-laying submarines, to get their mines more precise, laid more precisely, they needed really to have some sort of overwatch watching for surface ships, because otherwise they had to lay it at night. And laying at night does give them a surprise, but if they could launch one of these to provide overwatch, keep an eye out for hunting aircraft and hunting enemy ships, while they lay them at daytime, they could take visual checks of positions and give themselves a far greater accuracy of where they're laying their mines to block up enemy routes. So there are some really interesting ideas viable with this. They worked on further prototypes. There's the W27. Notice I said earlier the W21 to 26 designs, there is a dispute as to whether any of them, and principally it's usually the 23, I think, which is considered and looked at going, well, there might have been a prototype built for that. But as a rule, when they build prototypes, they build 3 of them. And there were 2 built of the W27. But we know they built roughly 3 aircraft at this point, and of course they built 3 of all the other ones. So I think that's where potentially they might have built a 23. They might have built one of the other designs as well to test it. And again, the W27 was built to test out ideas. It was powered by the Benz 3B, which was, 195 horsepower. Not bad for this time, not bad. It's a 2-seater, pilot, gunner. If you're looking and going, Alex, that's a really interesting design, there are some really interesting features in it. It's a conventional configuration, as much as you can get with the Hansa-Brandenburgs. It had its stilts rudder down low. Differed from early designs. Its fuselage is pretty much shorter than they were expecting. It had staggered wings, the eye struts for both the interplane and carbane bracing. So that's what they use, those single solid struts instead of the Forester struts, which, let's be honest, Hansa-Brandenburg was sort of known for by this point. You can go back to just as early as the W20, and that's quite a handful of struts. And we go back, there's quite a few there, and there's that's a lot of them, and there's a fair number going on there, and there's that, which is all that about. But again, they're experimenting, innovating, pushing forward, trying to work out the best configuration, and so they're trying this. Now, they liked it, but they thought they could do something slightly better. They really did. And they then adapted it, the W27 design, and they modified it into the W32 design, which was powered by the Mercedes D3 engine. Basically to test out the ideas some more. Again, this is another thing which is kind of interesting with the prototypes, because some of the prototypes for their aircraft, if they are keeping basically the same model but they're just playing around the engine, they give them a new number. So sometimes I do wonder if some of the prototypes that might have been built for some of those missing designs were simply just folded into the prototypes completed for the next ones. But again, there's a dispute over that. And when I say dispute, what I mean is there are pretty much 3 books which cover the construction side of German aircraft manufacture in World War I that actually do talk about the Hansa-Brandenburg and talk about the stuff aircraft related to the Kaiserliche Marine. The rest focus on the army. And that's understandable. They're ordering far more aircraft. Honestly, I understand this one. But once you're then dealing with, okay, which of those books has been quality in a quality way translated into English, you're then down to roughly 2. The third one's English translation is interesting, and there's that might give you the understanding why I'm not naming names, because if I start naming names of which books I've been using, it very quickly reveals which one I think has a very bad translation. And I have a rule whenever I'm talking about books on this channel. I will talk positively about books. I will mention books I like. I won't do it in such a way that shows books which I don't like, because I don't want to use my platform to attack other people when they don't have a right to reply. This is not a journal where I can write a review and they can respond. This is my YouTube channel. I could crush someone here. I could go through and point out every little mistake in their book, and I could completely eviscerate it. And they can't respond. They could maybe write a comment down below, but I'll probably be drowned out by, even in my channel with its not many subscribers, but enough, by the comments of people going, yeah, go for them, or this. And so that's not my way. So this is why I was going to do a section about the books, and then I realized reading it that the advice I'd had from colleagues about how one had been translated very poorly, in that they'd lost a lot of the meaning behind it, especially the technical words with the translation. There's one of the three, so the translations that sort of putting in English, I couldn't trust it at all. So when I'm saying there's a debate, that's because the two I could trust don't agree. The third one, I couldn't use it as a decider because it was a very bad translation. And really, it gets evolved into the 29. And the 29 is cool. You're probably looking at going, Alex, that's a monoplane. It is. And there are 402 of those built. There are. Now, again, interestingly enough, they serve with the Kaiserlich Marine, the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Royal Danish Navy, and the Royal Norwegian Army. They're introduced in mid-1918 and retired in 1936. Probably sitting there going, Alex, what happened? Well, there's a whole lot of things which go on with the W12 to turn into the W29 via the W27 and to an extent the W32. But let me just start off with some of the basic facts. Post-war, they are supposed to get rid of them. And pretty much what happens is Hansa-Brandenburg shuts down. It's shut down as part of the Treaty of Versailles. But the Hungarian Soviet Republic, which was the successor state to the Kingdom of Hungary in Austria, Hungary and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, ordered W29 to restart production. They completed 2 more for them. And then things started to be changed for Hansa-Brandenburg. They're allowed to continue to build W29s until mid-1919. The British took some, and they were very happy with them. The IJN managed to get hold of some. There's a whole discussion about who built what and how many of them actually ended up in service. There's a whole debate between various Japanese aviation historians. And again, that's really something interesting, because what I would say is it all depends on how much you trust the official sources, how many of those you think are built, and how many you think they really want them. But the Japanese really did like it. And again, the Danish and the Norwegians get it some slightly interesting ways. The 2 aircraft bought by the Norsk Aeroplanefabrik of Norway in 1920 were technically illegal, but the company claimed they were destroyed in fires. But then those aircraft were then leased by the factory to the Norwegian Army Air Service in May, and then purchased later that year. So, with that as their post-war world, what was their wartime service like? Well, They managed to get sent to occupied Belgium in May 1918 for combat evaluation, and there are no records about its activities existent that we can find. But we do start to find some results carrying out later on that year, because on the 4th of June, 4 aircraft of 1st Squadron, all flying the W-29s, encountered a flight of 3 Felix II F-2A flying boats out searching for submarines. They managed to shoot down 2, damage the 3rd, and Oberlieutenant Frederick Christiansen, who was in charge of them, was considered very capable, but the aircraft was doing well as well. 2 days later, he led 5 of the W-29s from 1st Squadron on a reconnaissance flight over North Sea, spotted HMS C-25, a British submarine, surfacing. They dropped to low altitude, machine-gunned the submarine, killed 5 men, punctured its ballast tanks, and so it's forced to return home on the surface. They're doing well. 18th of July, 1st Squadron again were on a long-range reconnaissance off the Kentish coast, with, they're not sure whether 6 or 7, because one of them did actually have to go home because of its having engine issues. And they managed to surprise a pair of short 184 float planes. Now, the 184s are the closest to a 2-seater fighter in some regards in the British scenario, but they are actually 2-seater reconnaissance bombing torpedo carrying aircraft. They were again on a anti-submarine patrol, and they were actually being escorted by a pair of Sopwith Camels. The British were having to do that because of the W-29s. They were having to escort their anti-submarine patrols with Camels. Sadly, one of the Camels' guns jammed, and so they were unable to drive off the aircraft, and both of the short 184s were shot down. All 4 of their crewmen were lost. The Camels had to disengage without damage. They managed to do all sorts of other interesting jobs, including attacking some British coastal motorboats, which were hunting for minesweepers, and the Austro-Hungarian Navy also put some orders in on the 26th of August 1918 for UFAG to build them at its Budapest factory. Unfortunately, only one's completed before the end of the war, and so it saw no service. But they had 10 under construction at the time, and those, along with the aircraft produced post-war, are what formed the Hungarian Squadron. And why was it so good? Well, again, Hansa-Brandenburg have been investing, have been producing good quality aircraft, and they're pushing forward this. This aircraft is built with a lot of interesting ideas put in. And remember what I said right back at the beginning. Castiglione is prepared to trust people with a lot of money, and is capable to trust them with a lot of money, because he has a lot of money, if he believes they're good, and if they have delivered on it. Heinkel's delivered. He's giving him a lot of money for development, he's giving him a lot of money for work, and this is what's come about. This is an aircraft which, well, how do I put this? The fuselage, the floats and tail unit remain unchanged. Heinkel had removed the upper wing, removed the centre section, and enlarged the lower wing. It was all very basic in principle, but it was also risky in a way, because you're trying to produce a reliable aircraft for overseas use. And again, note the phraseology there, overseas, not overseas, overseas use. The stress calculations were done by Heinkel's good right-hand man at the time, Hans Klemm, and he also seems to have done quite a lot of the detailed drawing or draftsman work on it, but Heinkel seems to have been staring over his shoulder quite a lot of the time. So it's a case of it's getting to the point already in his life, and I would say this continues as time goes on, but it's like Nelson choosing Hardy to be his captain for HMS Victory, his flag captain. He chooses him because he's tall and got good eyes. That's one of his reasoning. He likes him, and he's a very capable officer, but he's also very tall. It's the best methodology you can pick. And when you want to start to reach a certain point as my dad would have said, because he was a very qualified draftsman as part of his naval architecture training, could do a lot of freehand drawing. At a certain point, your eyes, your hands aren't as necessarily as good on the fine detail as they used to be. And you can sketch out the ideas and you can do things incredibly precisely, but you can do maybe one drawing in that time and you actually need to go sleep because you've reached that point in your life. You have a younger person who you have trained up and who is as skilled because you've trained them. This is how the master-apprenticeship relationship works in this scenario. Who you trust to do you do one of the drawings, they do the extra 5 or 6 that come for every one of you do. And that's what happens. So, going over doing the stress calculations, which are then checked, this is perfectly normal in this scenario. It did retain what's by this point the company's signature, plywood. Plywood. Why was I going to go for plywood? What is plywood? I have no idea. Plywood, slab-sided fuselage, which had inside it 4 main longerons and some stringers rising after the engine supports to support and elevate the observer's position, improving their field of fire. This was all done also in a way which retained the depth after the rear cockpit to improve lateral stability, and helped also with its narrowing to the knife edge, but more importantly to the shape of the aft, which provides maximum support for the rudder to be a maximum effective improved maneuverability. The rudder, of course, is attached to the, at the stern of the aircraft, and this had to be enlarged. On the first prototype, it was too small. They basically used the same rudder as they'd used on the W12, and that was way too small, so it had to be bigger. After the first prototype, they went, nah, it doesn't work. There's no vertical stabilizer, and the horizontal stabilizer is placed on top of the fuselage in order to keep it clear of the spray while taxiing. Again, something you have to consider with float planes. And they had actually changed and evolved the horizontal stabilizer and its elevators midway during production because they were producing aerodynamic interference between the tail structure and the elevator, which caused buffeting. Especially this was felt at low speeds when they were coming in and taking off. It was a really interesting occurrence for them. So they have all this work put into them. They have all the work done on their wings, which are variable thickness as they sort of over their length. The thickest portion is, of course, where it met the end struts of the floats. And further along, you see it tapers around those positions. So it provides strength where it needs to be strong, but where it can be thinner and more aerodynamic and therefore provide for greater speed, it is designed to do so. It is really, really designed to do so. And each of the 3 prototypes were equipped with different engines. They tried out a water-cooled and an inline, different water-cooled inline piston engine. The Benz BZ3, the BMW 3A, and the Mercedes D3. Now, initially, they selected the Benz 3 engine with its 150 to 180 horsepower, depending on its scenario, for the initial production aircraft. But with the exhaust manifold being removed and the pipes pointed upwards, however, later batches, they decided to go towards the Benz BZ3A engine. But there was one batch of 10 aircraft which used the BMW 3A, and there was a batch of 30 of them which were ordered with the D3A aircraft engine, which is fun. There was even one aircraft which was tested with the Maybach MB4A, which of course had 245 horsepower engine. But whilst flight testing revealed it was easier to fly, it was not as maneuverable as the other aircraft because its horsepower actually tended to overpower its controls. And this is something, again, you have to realise in these early aircraft, this was an issue for them. What's even more interesting, though, is this, of course, not the last aircraft to come to service. This is merely what's going to try and replace the W-12s. No, that's the Hansa-Brandenburg W33. This is, what can I say about this? Well, basically, kind of like the story of the W19, they basically went, we need something bigger. We need something bigger than even the 29. And so they built the 33. And it's definitely beloved by the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Finnish Air Force, and of course the Kaiserlich Marine. They are built for 1918 to 1919 and 1921 to 1929. There are 491 of these built, and honestly, they cause even more of an argument. Now, again, there are some who would put forward that this aircraft was designed by Dr. Hans Klemm. Of course, Heinkel's protege, as discussed earlier. And I would certainly say he has more to do with this design than even the W29. But I feel he'd still got a lot of Heinkel's overwatch and overlooking him. There is a lot of Heinkel going on in this design. And these were powered by the Maybach 4A, and originally. But eventually they decide to go with Mercedes D4As and eventually a Bus und Selv, Bus 4A engines will be fitted. Only 26 aircraft were built by Hansa-Brandenburg and 7 completed before the armistice. So, no. They do not get a lot of use by the Germans. In fact, the Kaiserlich Marine barely gets a look in. These are aircraft which mainly go on to be built by other powers. The Marine's Flyvbefrik, the Naval Aircraft Factory of Norway, built 24 for the Norwegian Navy. They were called the Mark II and eventually the Mark III. And one of the Mark IIIs was actually made for the army as well. The Mark I had been a license-built Hansa-Brandenburg W29. The Norwegians like them. And there are also some of these produced by the Norsk Aeroplanfabrik, the army aircraft factory. But those were later handed over to the Navy, along with 4 manufactured Mark IIIs, built at the Herrens Flyvenmaskinfabrik Keller Flyerfabrik, because the army no longer had use for them. And I'm going to apologise now to all the Norwegians, because I tend to pronounce Norwegian as well as German in today's video. I should have just given up with just German. I'm currently working on my Swedish. I think that's getting slightly better. I might do a bit of a video in Swedish at some point soon, just to test it out for all the Swedish speakers to see if they can understand what I'm saying. And to, of course, make fun of those who don't speak Swedish. Who knows? Honestly, I've got the app on my phone and I am doing my best to learn it, but yeah. I've just managed to get to the point where it's teaching me how to try and order Iron Brew. Suddenly I've become incredibly attentive in it. Now, honestly, the reason they're fitted with different engines is it depends what engines those factories could get hold of. So, realistically, when we start saying this is a Heinkel-designed aircraft, or even talking about it as being a Klemm-designed aircraft, we're really talking a bit of twaddle. Because those two people do not have a lot of involvement once they are designed to taken over by those companies, especially once war is over and Hansa-Brandenburg sort of ceases to exist very quickly. Finland obtained a manufacturing license for the W-33, and, well, they built them as the IVL A-22 Hunter, powered by Fiat engines. This was due to shortage of German engines, but they're 300 horsepower engines, so they're fairly good. And they really liked them. It became the first aircraft to be mass produced in Finland, and 120 were eventually built. They would operate the aircraft until 1936. Sometimes they had some Lewis guns fitted. Some of the Finnish aircraft also had their float planes replaced with skis. And in fact, I think that I'm not sure whose aircraft this was. It's I think it's a Norwegian one. I'm fairly certain it's a Norwegian Navy one. I'm fairly certain it is. But there is a whole discussion of them. And one of the things, again, I do find really beautiful about this company is that if you're looking at the various sources about it, some of the best sources are actually in Russian and Czech. But again, limit to finding good ones in English. There really is. Really, sadly is. Now, the other people who were similarly impressed with them were the Japanese. They received a single one as part of their war operations. But from 1922 to 1925, roughly 310 of these were built by Nakajima and Aki, with minor modifications. Now, they were popular with the high command. They weren't popular with the pilots, as they felt they had inadequate directional control and poor downward visibility from the cockpit. But they were flown from things like the Nagato for seaplane trials in 1926. But from 1927 onwards, they're gradually being replaced, and in theory they're all retired by 1928, although some of them find some interesting service as conversion to civilian aircraft, and some might have ended up in service of, how do I put this, espionage insertion. There is some really interesting discussions around how many were converted to civilian aircraft and how many might have masqueraded as civilian aircraft and been used for other things. This was an interesting discussion I read where I respect the authors. I do, but the actual amount of evidence they were able to find, for obvious reasons, was very limited, and therefore a large part of what they're saying was, trust me, it's my gut. Now again, that's something I will do on a video, because on a video I can give the context and I can give the exact phraseology of, this is me filling in the blanks based on my experience and study and knowledge in other areas, but I have no smoking gun document which points to that. I don't write that in my books because I can't give it that context. For me to write that in the books, I would have to have a smoking gun document which I can go to and go, there's at least one document which backs this up. So it's light, but there's one document. Preferably I'm looking for 2 or 3 documents which are primary sources which can back them up, i.e. a personal testimony from someone at the time contemporary, not 20, 30, 40 years later of what they think they saw, but preferably 5 years later of what they flew themselves. That sort of first-hand personal testimony account and documentation and those sort of things. That's what I would be looking for. But again, it does make a sense, because these were very good aircraft for doing that and landing all sorts of random places. Latvia even received some from the Finnish Air Force in December 1926, but both were wrecked the following March, which led to a massive rebuild. Such a large rebuild that they didn't return to service till 1928, and they were out of service again in 1933. And there's actually discussion whether or not they actually rebuild actually worked, or whether they were quietly supplied 2 new aircraft. There's a whole debate on that one. There is a load of stats I could give you about them, but honestly, none of them work out as that, because most of the stats available are for the, especially in the English language scenario, are for the ones fitted with a Maybach 6-cylinder engine, the Mark IVA, which was 245 horsepower. And as I've mentioned, the vast majority of them were produced with engines which were definitely not that and had 300 horsepower or more. Makes for different operating characteristics. It's amazing how much extra 55 horsepower can do for you in that kind of world. Oh well. It's an interesting time. Anyway, that gives us a run through of what were their fighter reconnaissance types. I know I included one of their bombers, and I did talk about some of their other aircraft, but I felt they added to the history and made it make sense. But we are talking about a very intriguing, very interesting manufacturer. I'm just deciding which picture I'm going to pick as my summary one. Honestly, I think it has to be the 12. I think it does. Because that really did set their stock on fire, as it were. This was an organization which had a lot of potential. And it's, again, one of those things, I get into trouble with this, but I'm going to keep saying this. Infrastructure-wise, organization-wise, the Germans were in a far better position in World War I than they were in World War II. Far better position. From naval perspective, and I would argue from aviation perspective, they have a far richer, far broader aviation capability in World War I than they do in World War II. And, to an extent, that is a product of who's in charge. In World War I, they really have no centralized organization trying to be in charge. They have lots of people asking for things and different companies trying to provide those things. But in World War II, they have Goering in charge. And Speer. And Speer is a fine architect and a fine organizer. And that's about all the nice things I can say about him. But he is not an innovator when it comes to ideas of engineering or aircraft development. He really isn't an innovator. He's not an innovator when it comes to architecture. We'll leave that to one side. Prior to him, it's Goering, who's even more of a monosyllabic thinker. And by that I mean his brain can only hold one word at a time, and that's me being charitable. He might have started off better when he was younger. I don't really have enough sources or frames of reference to discern, but I'm fairly sure by about the mid-1930s he's had so much alcohol and so many different chemicals in his system, his brain is ceasing to function on any level. I mean, other than ego. I honestly do not see it working. Hansa-Brandenburg produced good aircraft. I sort of summarize this all up. They were a good company, and they were the sort of company which couldn't have existed in the later period. Even Heinkel's own company was taken off him, because Heinkel, as great as he was, wasn't necessarily doing exactly what the Nazi Party wanted him to do. He was actually trying to think, trying to innovate to an extent, something which was, honestly, despite the German obsession of wonder weapons, is almost abhorrent to the Nazi system. It really is. It's a really weird scenario, Nazi Germany. I know I have regular fun with the wereabouts on this channel and various other channels. And I do have fun with some of the people who do like to pop into the comments, and I look at their comments and I go, I don't think you are a wereaboo, but I think you have definitely circulated in that group, judging by the phraseology of your questioning and your analysis and the way you postulate things. I do love the ways people like to say, well, if I'm just asking a question, I'm not making a statement, and you go, look at the phraseology of your question again. That's a statement, not a question. There is a way to phrase things. Oh no, there's the great thing of, what's that classic schoolyard bully who asks the kid why are they hitting themselves? They use their hand, they use the kid's own hand to bludgeon them. Yeah, that's not asking a question, is it? And that's a bit of an extreme example, but still. It's fun to watch. Sometimes I reply to them. Sometimes I think about doing a reply video to them. Sometimes I think I'm spending too much time dealing with lawyers all day, and I might not reply in the tone I would wish to, so I will ignore it until I'm no longer dealing with the lawyers, and then I will do a proper reply. I think that's often the better policy. Now, I know this is a premiere, and I'm not sure if I always finish these with a question or not, but I'm going to. I want you to think. I want you to really think about this. You see, the big problem for Hansa-Brandenburg, and I'd say for a lot of manufacturers at this point, they were very innovative when it came to their aircraft design, but they kept having problems with engine production. They kept having problems with the reliability of engine production and the needs of the engines. It's a constant theme for the Germans. In peacetime, they can go great guns in the horsepower race. In wartime, their engines are all too needy. So here's this. I want you to imagine what would Hansa-Brandenburg have been like if they'd been a British company or an American company, or maybe, considering where Castellani comes from, an Italian company. Had managed to recruit the same people, had the same philosophy, and let's be honest, Hankel is enough of a, whilst he's as proud as Germany as can be, he's enough of a mercenary and likes his freedom to build what he wants to build enough that I could see him going and working for a factory in the other side, if it's run by the right person, and the right amount of money is being offered. How do you think it would have evolved in interwar years? Where do you think it would have gone to? Because this is a really interesting thing for me to think about. This Hansa-Brandenburg company, look at where it's starting. Look at how much it's innovating. Look at, yeah, there are problems with some of these aircraft. That's pretty darn good. That needs some more work. But the reality is, this aircraft is literally coming into service as the war is ending. It's literally 7 have been finished by the time the war's ended. Come on. They haven't actually built enough of them to try and work out all the kinks yet. So it'd be really interesting to see where you think they could have gone. I think there's no interwar scenario after a Treaty of Versailles unless you radically alter the Treaty of Versailles. And that would mean you'd have to radically alter France and Britain. That Germany keeps an aviation industry and can support the growth of the company. And even then, do you see Hitler leaving Castellani and in charge of it? I don't. He's far too powerful and far too not what Hitler wants to be left with it. Might have had a measure of protection, considering he would be Italian by that point, so he would have had Il Duce as his protection, but Il Duce's protection doesn't always count for that much. Right, and what do we have coming up next week? Next week we have French naval aircraft to squadron systems, and of course tomorrow night we have Louis Battenberg remains in charge of the Admiralty. How does that affect the First World War? How does him not being distracted by fighting for his position against the besieging forces of Lord Fisher affect the opening period of World War I? It's an interesting question. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, please do consider liking, sharing, maybe subscribing. I always like more subscribers. Still have that ongoing competition bet between my mother and my aunt over that one. And if you want to support my very unhealthy book habit, but constant purchasing of books, which helps me do a lot of the work for this channel, and whilst also doing a lot of research elsewhere, and funds all of that, because this is the only research funding I get, then please consider maybe becoming a member of the channel, which I think is about down there, or Patreon or Ko-fi. And currently Patreon has the June topic suggestions live. And as I've said before in videos, that's going to be a slightly different month because I'm going to pick the four top scoring ones, the ones which get to the highest four sets of votes from subscribers. And remember, subscribers can vote for as many, patrons can vote for as many as they like. The ones which get the most the four which get the most votes will be turned into premieres like this for videos being. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed and taking the time to watch it. And take care.